Well, Max Verstappen and Red Bull won it after all. Would you believe it? There's Adrian Newey on the grid with his notebook and his pen. Everybody else is faffing around doing this, doing that. And you got this feeling that there was a moment of calm there, wasn't there? There was just this approach to the race, starting P10, what can we do differently? Got to make sure we get through the first corner. And I think Adrian's demeanor summed it all up. Anyway, before we go too far into what was a very complicated race, complicated because there were so many different tyre choices on the grid because of the weather and because of where people were starting, the potential weather that is. So before we go any further, let's have a look at what the engineers chose to put their drivers on for the start of this Hungarian Grand Prix, the key drivers. Anyway, if we start at the front on the pole with George Russell, imagine what he felt like when he woke up Sunday morning. Mercedes, no surprise here, chose to put him on the soft tyre. Now that was the tyre obviously that he used in qualifying. That was the tyre in which Mercedes found the biggest sweet spot they've had all year. They were really quick on this tyre yesterday. And the track conditions for the race, very similar to yesterday, 27, 26. Temperature dropping slightly as they stood on the grid. So Mercedes going for, well, this is the product we know. George loves the car like this. Let's put the softs on. And in any event, it could well rain somewhere into the race. And if he's on soft tyres and he's got a bit of a lead, that's got to be good as well. So no surprise there. The two Ferraris behind him, they chose to put on the medium tyres. That shows, I think, that Ferrari had a longer term view of this race. They felt that they probably had the better car over a 70 lap distance, and it showed a little bit in qualifying, didn't it? The more they ran in this weird situation of cooler temperatures, trying to get the best from the tyres, the more Ferrari did find their sweet spot as well. Not the sweet spot they've known and loved at various other races this year, but certainly one that allowed the drivers to have a car that was reasonably chuckable and doable with and play with the variables. And that was a car that obviously they felt they didn't need to give soft tyre grip to in the early laps. Let's put it on the medium, try to get a decent stint and then see what happens. A little bit of thinking there probably about when the rain was going to come and therefore a little bit longer in that first stint to try to match perhaps the first stop with a stop for intermediates or wets. It made sense too to have Lando Norris also on the soft tyre, basically for the same reasons that we've just talked about with George Russell and Mercedes. So he was on the soft. The really interesting choices for me were always going to be Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. I was quite surprised to see Lewis on the medium tyre, I must say, because where he was on the grid, P7, you would imagine they'd be wanting to give him as much grip off the line as they could, the ability to get through some traffic early on, and then to see where he was going to be. But interestingly, and I don't know whether Lewis had something to do with this, they made a really good choice, I think, proved me completely wrong, by going onto the medium tyre. This showed total confidence in Lewis's ability and Lewis's own self-confidence, of course, to get the car off the line cleanly, to make up ground in that first corner when everybody's scrabbling around, and then to have the benefit of the medium tyre to take him into a reasonably long stint against what Mercedes no doubt imagined would be quite a lot of opposition choosing the soft tyre. Not the least of which was Max Verstappen in the Red Bull, of course. They did exactly what I've just said, went for grip off the line. Let's get Max past some cars early on, starting P10, remember, and then see what happens from there. So no surprise really, I guess, that Max went for that soft tyre option, but a big surprise for me that Lewis went for the medium, and I think that was a really decisive choice, and to some extent it's the reason he was able to do so well in the back end of the race. Now let's have a look and see what happened off the line. Lewis Hamilton indeed made a great start, even though he was on the medium tyres. He was down there like a jackrabbit into the first corner, passing people, moving around and doing really well. Max Verstappen similarly really good, as you would expect off the line on the soft tyres, picking up places as well. And quite quickly, Lewis and Max were able to find a way past the two Alpines and then sat behind Lando Norris's McLaren on the soft tyres. Very difficult when the soft tyre was in its prime for Lewis to do much about the McLaren, but as soon as it started to go off, this was about lap 11, lap 12, Lewis was all over him and got him in a beautiful pass at the end of the straight, which had then obliged Lando to come in. Obviously, Max got in very quickly as well. So there were Lewis and Max running towards the end of the first stint. Lewis on the medium tyre, Max on the soft tyre, but the soft tyre on the Red Bull looking really good and not going off particularly quickly. Anyway, let's go back to the start of the race, because George Russell also made the start that inevitably he was going to do from the pole on that soft tyre in the Mercedes. And by the end of lap 1, he had 2 seconds over Carlos Sainz. To give him his due, Carlos was all over George going into turn one, round the outside, looking for a way to fluster him, but George isn't that sort of driver, and very quickly pulled away from the two Ferraris, with Carlos Sainz ahead of Charles Leclerc. And it was here, with Charles Leclerc dropping 2 seconds at some point behind Carlos Sainz, that to some extent, and this is another subsection to the story, to some extent, this is where Charles Leclerc won this race. He didn't win the race, but he should have won the race, in my view. This is where Charles Leclerc was really good. He was just watching and waiting while Carlos was following George Russell, and George was having some good laps, pulling away from Carlos, benefiting from that soft tyre. But then equally, Carlos quite comfortably could close the gap if he needed to. So it was never more than about 2 seconds. Sometimes it was under that, sometimes it was over that. And then there's Charles watching Carlos Sainz, thinking, how am I going to pass these guys? I've got a race car here today that I can win with. So what happened? Well, the first thing that happened is that inevitably George's tyres started to go off, and Carlos started to put real pressure on the Mercedes. And at this moment, Charles Leclerc's thinking, I can do a better job than Carlos Sainz in trying to get past here. And he's on the radio saying, should we be changing positions here? What should we be doing? No instruction came back that we heard anyway. And anyway, Charles sitting there. Now he's right behind Carlos Sainz. And George, in the end, pulls into the pits and saves it for everybody. So it's now Carlos Sainz leading Charles Leclerc. And Ferrari, I think probably sensing some sort of impending drama, decided to bring Carlos Sainz in the lap after George has stopped. George is on the soft tyre, remember. Carlos is on the medium tyre. In theory, he's got at least another 5 or 6 laps left on that medium tyre, but they bring him in early, and then they put another set of mediums on Carlos's car. So now it's about lap 20, and Charles Leclerc finds himself leading the Hungarian Grand Prix. Carlos Sainz has stopped early, and he's leading George Russell, who's on a new set of mediums, by about 18 seconds. Of course, at this moment, George is going quicker than Charles, but nonetheless, it's shaping up at the least to be a closely run thing. And now we need to flash back to the Hamilton versus Verstappen battle, because Red Bull also decide to bring Max in very early, around lap 16. That's because there does seem to be, I think, a threat of rain. A few drops are falling, and Red Bull are probably thinking the soft tyres at the end of its life will put him on a new set of mediums now, just to make sure he's got new tyres underneath him if it does start to rain. That also has the effect of undercutting Lewis Hamilton. So when Lewis stops 3 laps later, Max is now ahead of Lewis. A really nice undercut job by Red Bull in what turns out to be the fight of the race in terms of the race to the checkered flag and the eventual result. So that is where Max Verstappen got in front. And now they're both on medium tyres, but Lewis is 3 laps newer than Max Verstappen's. And they're running 5th and 7th with a Fernando Alonso Alpine split between them momentarily. But that is, of course, where the end of the race focus will be. So at the front, Charles Leclerc is now thinking, how long can I run this first stint on these mediums? And if I do stop, will I be in front of George Russell when I come out? The answer to that is yes, he could. Charles Leclerc did a really, really good job at this phase of the race. George Russell is on his new mediums, but there's Charles on the set on which he started the race, and he's only losing 0.2, 0.3 second a lap to George Russell. So Charles Leclerc extended that first stint by about 3 to 4 laps compared with his teammate Carlos Sainz, who also started on the medium tyre, and now he's looking really strong. He duly stops for a new set of mediums and then comes out not only leading the Hungarian Grand Prix, but leading the Hungarian Grand Prix on the newest set of tyres out there. So by any standards, he's looking really, really strong. How then did Charles Leclerc lose this race? Well, just when we thought Ferrari had run out of creative ways of helping Charles Leclerc to lose yet another Grand Prix, magically they found another method. And that was on lap 39, when Max Verstappen's crew felt there was more rain in the air. They brought him in again surprisingly early for a new set of mediums. George Russell immediately responded to that the following lap. And you'd think now that Charles, with at least a 5-lap margin left in his set of mediums, having done such a good job on that first stint, would be in even better shape. What did Ferrari do? They brought him in as well. And not only did they bring him in ridiculously early, but they also put hard tyres on the Ferrari. Now, the hard tyre is not a compound that Charles Leclerc had run at any stage of the weekend, either on Friday or Saturday. When the temperatures dropped on Saturday, Ferrari eventually found a balance on the soft tyre, and you'd have to assume that on the medium it wasn't going to be quite as good. on the hard, you wouldn't even imagine they'd go near it, bearing in mind how different the Ferrari handling and grip level was when the temperatures came down. But they put Charles on the hard, obviously thinking, oh, we'll run him till the end of the race now, that'll cover him in case there's rain, real rain coming. Forgetting and not looking, presumably, at what had happened at Alpine when Fernando Alonso had gone onto the hard tyre after his first run on mediums and was all over the place. He could barely put the power down on the road. I don't know if they were watching that or not at Ferrari, but that was a signal, I would have thought, to the entire pit lane to just stay away from the hard tyre. I know others did run the hard and they kind of made it work, but we're talking about a fight for the lead of the race here. We're talking about the Ferrari driver, Charles Leclerc. They put him on the hard tyre, and indeed, it was like ice. He rejoined, and it was basically just target practice for the likes of a Max Verstappen or a George Russell. He had absolutely no way of defending at all. And in the end, Ferrari threw in the towel on the hard tyre, brought him in again for a set of softs. But of course, it was far too late then, and the best he could do was finish sixth. So I put this under the heading of what they did at Monaco when they didn't put him on the slicks, when it was quite clear that was where he should have been. This putting him on the hard tyre in the middle of the Hungarian Grand Prix, absolutely no logic to it, total panic reaction to what was going on with Max Verstappen, and bore no relation to anything they'd been doing that weekend anyway, particularly not running the hard, and also how good they were on the soft and medium when the temperatures came down. So by any standards, that was a catastrophic race for Charles Leclerc. One where, okay, he may not have won it, but it would have been a really, really close race with Max Verstappen towards the, as they went to the checkered flag. So that, if you like, just opened the race up to the Max Verstappen-Lewis Hamilton fight. Carlos Sainz, where was Carlos in all of this? Well, Ferrari did the right thing. He seemed to be falling asleep halfway through the race, as he did last year in Hungary. But they brought him in for the second stop and put him on a set of softs, and that revitalised him, and he drove pretty well towards the back end of the race to finish fourth. But it wasn't enough, with the tyres going off in the closing stages, to defend from George Russell, who was really quick in the closing stages, even though he was on medium tyres. So there's no way Carlos really should have been beaten by George later on. He'll say that the soft tyre had gone off, and let's have a look. He ran 23 laps on the soft tyre. But Lewis Hamilton went on the soft for his third run, really quick at the end of his 19-lap stint on that. So for me, that was a very disappointing stint for Carlos Sainz on the soft tyre. And again, you've got to think, what are Ferrari doing? They started second and third in that race, and they didn't have either car on the podium. Lewis beat George at the end of the race because he ran medium, soft, and the soft at the end of the race with the car on light fuel, very similar to what we saw yesterday in qualifying and how quick the Mercedes was then. But because George had started on the soft, his first stint was necessarily relatively short. The first stint on mediums was therefore necessarily short, and it was therefore too long, too big an ask to put him back onto softs for that third stint. So in terms of the strategy, looking back now at what we were saying at the start of the race and what the Mercedes engineers were thinking, Lewis Hamilton and his engineers got it absolutely right. Starting on that medium was not only the right choice in terms of getting him off the line, doing what he needed to do early on to establish himself, but it gave him that lovely position of being on the softs at the end of the race, and he maximised that. And so that's basically how the race fell into place in terms of the tyres they chose, the number of pit stops they made, and the strategy that defined the overall structure. But within it all, we saw some wonderful driving. We saw up close and personal Lewis Hamilton against George Russell. And we saw there, particularly going to the last corner, the difference between the two of them. George, characteristically, a slightly longer corner, slightly later turn in, and slightly more aggressive on the initial steering point, whereas Lewis is going in early, everything's really soft. And I'm not saying it was actually quicker or better on that corner, it was just the difference in style. What it was, of course, was a style that enabled Lewis Hamilton to make his tyres last as long as they did, particularly the soft tyres, Carlos Sainz, please note. So that was one thing I thought was really interesting. Also, when Lewis was behind Lando, you could see a massive difference. I put massive in italics here between, and this is 2 years ago we've been seeing this. We saw it first time in Austria. We saw it again now in Hungary. Massive difference in the initial turn-in between Lewis and Lando. As soft as Lando's inputs are, and he does look great in the car, he's still got this really long corner and he's going in much wider than Lewis everywhere. I thought the best bit of the race, and you probably did too, was when Max Verstappen was on his fresh set of last mediums, the tyres he had taken to the checkered flag, and at this point Charles is still on his ridiculous hard tyres, and out of the pits Max does a nice pass on Charles, and then coming out of the second last corner of the lap, he does a 360, and it's absolutely brilliant. If you can watch that with the sound up, you'll see the back end goes, and as soon as he knows that he's not going to be able to hold it and it's got to be a spin, you just hear him floor the throttle and the revs go up, and he just uses the energy of the car and the throttle to just spin the car around and do a 360 and continue. That turns out to have been a result of a clutch drama that Max had off the line, even though he made a very good start, and which was interfering with some of his gear changing. And there was, I made a note of it, there was an instruction to Max quite early on, which was 020 fail, 20 fail, which presumably is some sort of clutch or diff setting that helped him get around that problem. So next time we hear that 20 fail, we know that he's got a clutch problem in the car. But yeah, that was a lovely moment from Max. There were some great passes around the outside. I thought Charles Leclerc did a great pass on George Russell, because it wasn't, I mean, George is not the easiest guy to overtake. He just positions the car beautifully. And in the end, basically Charles just had to run around the outside until he eventually got an inside run for the next corner. And it was a lovely piece of driving by both of them. There was no, as close as it was beautiful to watch as well. Which brings me back to Charles Leclerc, actually. I mean, we can think now, everyone's saying, you know, what are they going to do in the August break? Well, from what I was saying yesterday, I'm still staggered at how well Lewis Hamilton's driving and the level of motivation that he has. And this, of course, will be a massive help to him. And if he can win a Grand Prix or two, which is what he'd be thinking about during the August break, you know, what a brilliant year for him in some respects. And Max, of course, will be going to wherever he goes and just relaxing, thinking, you know, light up the cigar. I've got to make sure I keep my head down. Knowing Max, he'll be thinking, I've got to keep my head down. Nothing is a given. We've got to keep focusing on a race-by-race basis. I'm sure he'll be like that. But what will Charles Leclerc be doing? If anybody comes up to Charles and says, Charles, I've just added up the number of points that you should have scored and didn't in this first half year, he'll probably be dispatched very, very quickly from the near environs of said C. Leclerc, because he doesn't need to be reminded. Ferrari for sure no. And this was a race, yet another race, which Charles Leclerc, it's not absolute given, but was a pretty good chance he would have won it. And think about when they made that panic stop for Charles and brought him in and put the hard tyres on, he was 7 seconds ahead of Max Verstappen on the road. But not only that, he had George Russell and Carlos Sainz between him and Max. And so you'd have to say that all things being equal, if Ferrari had kept him out for another 4 or 5 laps, then probably, even if Max had been really quick in the closing stages, it would have been really close. And the odds are that Charles Leclerc would have won that Grand Prix. So, you know, it is just, I'm completely at a loss to explain how Ferrari could have done that yet again on a day when they had a very good race car, compared with Red Bull, compared with Mercedes, no doubt about that. And after that, of course, in the closing stages, with rain approaching, this was Max Verstappen City, Arizona, because nothing better for a driver like Max to know that everybody's panicking potentially about rain. A little drizzle, as he called it. He's on the medium tyre. Yes, Carlos Sainz is on the soft, but his tyres were starting to go away. And as it happened, the last couple of laps were cruised anyway when Valtteri Bottas pulled up to a halt in the Alfa Romeo. Virtual safety car came out, which meant they pussyfooted around. Maybe the rain fell a little bit harder than if the race had finished a few minutes earlier, but nonetheless, just 1 lap to go. Max had an easy job of just taking it through to win from P10 on the grid. Really good strategy, obviously, really good overtakes, and helped enormously by Charles Leclerc's strategy. The strategy on Charles Leclerc's car, let's not put him at the beginning of the sentence because it implies that Charles himself made the mistakes. So yeah, it definitely helped there. Fastest lap to Lewis Hamilton went on the soft tyres in his chase of Max. Carlos Sainz, please note, who was also on the soft tyres on the Ferrari. And overall, George Russell will not be unhappy with P3, having taken his first pole position on the Saturday. Anyway, it is the August break, as they say, and we'll take a bit of a break, I guess, but I'll try and put some videos out on YouTube. But equally, we're going to continue doing our live streams on Twitch. I'll be doing some probably back end of next week. Let's call it the Hungarian Grand Prix debrief. Let the dust settle a little bit. That'll probably be more Thursday, Friday, rather than the first 3 days of this week when I've got other commitments. So I'll be putting notice about that out on Twitter, about the Twitch live feed, that is. And I'll, of course, be doing some more YouTube videos before everything restarts at the end of August. But it's a good moment to say thank you very much indeed, everybody who subscribes to this channel, who's been watching this channel. Thank you to Jetcraft for your support of this channel. And to say, if you are going away, have a great holiday. See you again soon and take care.